Imagine a soldier walking through the front door of his home. The war is over. The deployment ended months ago. Outside, everything looks normal. Cars pass on the street. Neighbors walk their dogs. Someone is mowing the lawn. But inside his mind, something hasn't changed. For most people, war is something that happens far away, on the news, on a map. And when soldiers come home, we assume the war is over. But for thousands of American veterans, the war never really ends. More than 2.7 million Americans served in Iraq and Afghanistan. Many of them deployed multiple times. Some spent years moving between combat zones and home. And while the headlines focused on battles, strategies, and politics, another story was quietly unfolding, a psychological one. Because modern wars are different. They last longer. They have no clear ending. And the battlefield doesn't always stay overseas. Sometimes it follows soldiers home. So the real question isn't just how wars are fought. It's something much deeper. What happens to the human mind when a generation spends decades at war? Because the true cost of endless wars is not always measured in victories or defeats. Sometimes it's measured in silence. Most people imagine war as something with clear ending, a beginning, a battle, and then a victory. History books are full of those moments. World War II ended with surrender. Cities celebrated. Soldiers came home. There was a moment when everyone knew it was over. But modern wars don't work like that anymore. Now imagine something different. Imagine waking up every day in a place where nothing feels predictable. The sun rises over a dusty base somewhere in the Middle East. The air is already hot. A convoy prepares to leave the gate. Engines start. Radios crackle. And before the patrol even begins, one thought is already there. Not if something will happen, but when. Because modern wars rarely have a clear front line. Danger can be anywhere. A road that looked safe yesterday. A building that was empty last week. A quiet street that suddenly isn't. For soldiers deployed in places like Iraq or Afghanistan, every routine action carries a question behind it. What's behind that wall? Who just walked around that corner? Why did that car slow down? These are not occasional fears. They are constant. The human brain was designed to react to danger, but only for short periods of time. A sudden threat, a burst of adrenaline, then recovery. But war changes that rhythm. In long conflicts, the brain never really gets a signal that it's safe again. Instead, it learns something else. Stay alert, all the time, for months, sometimes years. Now think about what that does to a person. Imagine living every day with your senses turned all the way up. Every sound matters. Every movement means something. A door slams. Your body reacts before your mind does. A loud bang echoes across the street. Your heart races instantly, even when nothing is happening. This state has a name many soldiers know well. Hypervigilance. It's the feeling that danger could appear at any moment. And during deployment, that instinct can save lives. But here's the problem. When the war lasts for years, the brain starts to believe that this is normal. That constant tension becomes a new baseline. The mind adapts to survival mode. Now imagine something else. The deployment ends. The plane lands back in the United States. Families wait at the airport. Children run forward. Hugs, tears, relief. From the outside, the war seems finished. But the brain doesn't switch off that easily. Because for years, it learned a simple rule. Stay ready. Stay alert. Don't relax. And that rule doesn't disappear the moment a soldier steps back into civilian life. So now imagine something small. A veteran is standing in a grocery store. A shopping cart falls. Metal hits the floor. The sound echoes through the aisle. For most people, it's just noise. For someone who spent years in a combat zone, the body reacts instantly. Muscles tighten. Eyes scan the room. The brain is searching for something that isn't there anymore. And in that moment, something becomes clear. War didn't end when the deployment ended. Because the hardest battlefield to leave is the one inside the mind. And the longer a war lasts, the deeper those patterns become. Which raises a difficult question. What happens when a nation fights wars that last not just years, but decades? Not every wound from war can be seen. Some never appear on medical scans. They don't leave scars on the skin. They don't show up in photographs. And yet, they can follow a soldier for the rest of their life. Imagine meeting a veteran sitting quietly in a small cafe. He looks calm. Maybe he's drinking coffee. Maybe he's scrolling through his phone. Maybe he's just watching the street through the window. From the outside, nothing seems unusual. But inside his mind, something else might be happening. Because one of the most difficult parts of modern war isn't always the moment of danger. It's the memory of it. The human brain has an incredible ability to remember threats. It does this to protect us. If something nearly harms us once, the brain tries to make sure we never forget it. But in war, those moments don't happen once. They can happen again and again. An explosion on a road, gunfire in the distance, a night where sleep never really came. The brain records everything. The sounds, the tension, the fear. And sometimes those memories don't stay in the past. You may have heard the term PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, but the name itself doesn't fully explain what it feels like. For many veterans, it isn't just remembering something bad that happened. It's reliving it. Imagine lying in bed at night. The room is quiet. The lights are off, but your mind begins replaying moments from years ago. The same sounds, the same images, over and over. Sleep becomes difficult. Some nights, impossible. Other times, the reaction happens during the day. Picture a veteran walking through a crowded parking lot. A car suddenly backfires nearby. A sharp pop echoes through the air. For most people, it's just a brief noise. But for someone whose brain learned to associate that sound with danger, the reaction is immediate. Heart racing, breathing faster, muscles tightening. The body prepares for a threat that isn't actually there. This is one of the hardest parts of psychological trauma. The brain doesn't always understand that the environment has changed. It reacts as if the battlefield is still nearby. And for many veterans, these invisible wounds create challenges that others rarely see. Concentration becomes harder. Sleep becomes unpredictable. Crowded places feel overwhelming. Even moments that should feel peaceful can carry tension. A quiet room, a loud sound, a sudden movement. Small things can trigger memories that the mind never fully processed. And yet, most of these struggles remain hidden. Because unlike physical injuries, psychological wounds are not always obvious. A soldier might look perfectly healthy, standing tall, walking normally, smiling in photographs with family. But inside, the brain may still be adjusting to years spent in survival mode. For decades, war stories often focus on the battles themselves, the strategies, the victories, the losses. But in recent years, researchers and doctors have begun paying closer attention to something else, the lasting psychological impact. Studies of veterans from Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan have revealed patterns that repeat across generations. Different wars, different places, but often the same invisible struggles. The human mind carries experiences longer than we expect, and the longer the conflict, the more those experiences accumulate. Which brings us to another question. If a single deployment can change how the brain reacts to the world, what happens when soldiers return to war again, and again, and again? For most of American history, wars had a rhythm. A country would mobilize, soldiers would deploy, a conflict would end, then a generation would return home. But something changed in the early 21st century. The United States entered wars that didn't follow that rhythm anymore. Instead of years, they lasted decades. And that created something the country had rarely experienced before, an entire generation that grew up inside a cycle of war. Think about this for a moment. A young American enlists in the military at 19. He finishes training. Soon after, he deploys. Months later, he comes home. Friends celebrate. Family gathers. Life resumes. But then, not long after, another deployment begins. Different year, different mission, but often the same desert landscapes, the same patrols, the same uncertainty. For many soldiers in Iraq and Afghanistan, deployment wasn't a single chapter. It was a repeating one. 2 deployments. 3, sometimes 4 or more. Now imagine what that does to a person's sense of time. Life begins to divide into two different worlds. There's the world at home, birthdays, family dinners, quiet streets. And then there is the other world, dusty bases, armored vehicles, radio chatter in the early morning. One moment you are back with your family. The next, you are halfway across the world again. For some service members, this cycle lasted most of their adult lives. A soldier might leave home when his child is a baby, return when that child is learning to walk, deploy again when the child starts school. Imagine watching your son grow up through short visits between deployments. Imagine missing holidays, birthdays, ordinary moments that most families take for granted. Now multiply that experience across thousands of families, across years, across decades. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan lasted longer than many people expected, long enough for soldiers to deploy multiple times, long enough for new recruits to join conflicts that had already been going on for years. In some cases, soldiers entered the military after the wars began and left the military before those wars officially ended. This created a unique kind of pressure because each deployment required the mind to switch environments again. Civilian life, then combat readiness, then civilian life again. The brain constantly adjusting between two very different realities. One requires calm. The other requires constant vigilance. And over time, that cycle can create a strange feeling. Home begins to feel unfamiliar. War begins to feel normal. Some veterans have described this transition in simple terms. In combat zones, the rules are clear. You know where you are. You know your mission. You know who is beside you. But back home, life moves differently. The pace is slower. The threats are invisible. The structure disappears. Suddenly, the environment that was once familiar feels confusing, and the place that once felt dangerous feels strangely predictable. This doesn't happen to every soldier, but it happens often enough that psychologists have noticed a pattern. Repeated exposure to combat environments changes how the brain processes safety and risk. When someone spends years living in high-alert conditions, the mind learns to expect them, which means return to ordinary life can feel more difficult than people realize. Now, consider the scale of this experience. Millions of Americans served in the wars of the last 2 decades. Many of them deployed multiple times, which means the psychological effects of long conflicts are not limited to individuals. They ripple outward into families, communities, entire generations. Children grow up with parents who spent years away. Spouses learn to manage long stretches of uncertainty. Parents wait for phone calls from the other side of the world. War becomes something that quietly shapes everyday life, not just on distant battlefields, but inside homes across the country. And when conflicts stretch across decades, the psychological impact spreads just as far, because wars that last this long don't just affect soldiers. They shape an entire generation around them. When people think about the cost of war, they usually imagine battlefields, explosions, armored vehicles, soldiers moving through unfamiliar cities. But the most complicated part of war often begins much later, long after the deployments end, long after the headlines move on. Imagine an ordinary evening in a quiet American neighborhood. A family sits around the dinner table. Plates clink softly. Someone laughs at a small joke. The television murmurs in the background. From the outside, everything looks peaceful. But for many veterans, moments like this can carry a quiet tension, not because something is wrong, but because the mind is still adjusting to a world that feels very different from the one it spent years preparing for. For soldiers returning from long wars, the transition back into civilian life is rarely instant. Combat requires a specific mindset. You stay alert. You read every environment. You watch for changes that might signal danger. In war zones, that awareness can mean survival. But when that same mindset follows someone home, everyday life can feel strangely complicated. A crowded shopping mall, a busy highway, a loud stadium during a football game. These places are normal parts of civilian life. But for someone whose brain has spent years scanning for threats, they can feel overwhelming. The mind keeps searching for patterns. Where are the exits? Who is moving strangely? What just made that sound? Even when nothing is wrong, the brain continues to operate in a system it learned during deployment. And this is where the hidden cost of endless wars becomes most visible. Because the war doesn't stay overseas. It travels quietly inside memory. Many veterans describe a strange contradiction when they return home. They missed home deeply while deployed. They counted the days until they could return. But once they are finally back, something feels slightly out of place. Friends talk about everyday problems, work deadlines, traffic, weekend plans. And for a moment, the conversation feels distant. Not because those things are unimportant, but because the mind has spent years focused on a completely different set of priorities. Safety, survival, the people beside you in the field. This gap between those worlds can create a feeling many veterans struggle to explain. They are home, but part of them still feels somewhere else. Now imagine this happening across thousands of households, across cities and towns throughout the country. A veteran returning to college classes, another starting a new job, another quietly adjusting to family life again. Each one carrying experiences that are difficult to describe to people who were never there. And yet, something remarkable also happens during this transition. Many veterans develop a deep resilience, a strong sense of loyalty, a quiet understanding of what pressure truly feels like. But resilience doesn't erase the psychological weight of long wars. It simply helps people carry it. Researchers who study veterans have found that the psychological cost of prolonged conflict doesn't disappear quickly. It unfolds slowly over years, sometimes decades, which means the true impact of endless wars cannot be measured only during the years when battles are happening. It continues long after, inside memories, inside relationships, inside the quiet adjustments veterans make as they rebuild their lives. And perhaps that leads to a question that rarely appears in history books. When historians talk about wars, they often focus on dates. When the war began, when the war ended, who won, who lost. But for the people who fought in those conflicts, the timeline can feel very different, because the war doesn't end the moment a treaty is signed, or when the last troops leave. For many veterans, the real ending happens much later, gradually, quietly, in ordinary moments. The first time they sleep through the night without waking up, the first time a loud noise doesn't trigger a reflex, the first time the mind finally believes that the danger is gone. And that raises one final thought. When we talk about the cost of endless wars, we often measure it in budgets, strategies, and political debates. But perhaps the deeper cost is something harder to see. The years it takes for the human mind to return from a place it was trained never to relax. Because in the end, wars are not only fought with weapons, they are also carried in memory, sometimes for the rest of a lifetime. And maybe the most important question we can ask is not just how wars begin, but how long their echoes remain. If you believe the human side of war deserves more attention and more honest conversations, subscribe to the channel, because some of the most important battles in history are the ones that continue long after the war is over.